Smash Hit started in 1978, started by a guy called Nick Logan, who had the bright idea that there were magazines that had always published the song lyrics of the current hits, but they'd never been very good and they'd never had much colour in them. And so Nick's simple idea was, do this and just do it for a generation who were starting to demand more colour and more polish. And it started off as a monthly and they put out 100,000 copies. It was nearly called Disco Fever, because disco was very big at the time, which is incredible when you think about it. And it sold 100,000, they put out more copies, sold 200,000, put out more copies, sold 300,000, and then they went fortnightly with it. And it grew and grew and grew and grew. You know, and I suppose its heyday was in the 80s, and its very pinnacle in the late 80s, it had an issue that sold 1 million copies, which is a massive amount for this country. Nothing sells 1 million copies. 700,000 tends to be the top. So it was an absolute phenomenon. And you know, you talk to people who were teenagers in the 80s and the 90s, it meant absolutely everything to them. And then it slowly declined during the 90s, and they tried everything to turn it round, and nothing really affected it. And some very bright people did loads and loads of things, but they couldn't get it to change. They couldn't get the circulation to turn around. And which proves one important thing, that in publishing, when it's going brilliantly, you're not a genius. And when it's going badly, you're not an idiot. You know, it's the tides of fashion and how people are and what the competition is and the economy and all those kind of things. I suppose in the end, what did for Smash Hits was a combination of the internet, mobile phones, digital radio, iPods, all these things. And that when I used to edit Smash Hits, it was edited, in my mind, for a 15-year-old called Tracy who lived in Grantham. And we picked Grantham because the art director, Steve Bush, came from Grantham, and he always used to say it was the most boring place in Britain. So we used to have a vision of 15-year-old Tracy who had nothing to do but sit on the edge of the War Memorial in Grantham watching the cars go by. And every 2 weeks, her life was immeasurably enlivened by the arrival of this fantastic, exotic, colourful, funny thing, Smash Hits. Well, nowadays, Tracy won't be sitting on the War Memorial anymore. She'll be in her own bedroom, where she's got her own television. She'll be texting, phoning, instant messaging, watching the TV, with her iPod on, and probably pretending to do a bit of homework at the same time. So here's my theory, and I challenge you on this one, okay? I think teenagers used to be bored. I don't think they are anymore. I think they're distracted, but they're not bored. And I think that's a bad thing, because boredom, if you want to know what made Britain great as a pop music nation, boredom, yeah? Living in miserable little towns where it rained all the time and there was nothing to do, so you went and formed a band, or you invented punk rock, or whatever. I think that's gone. It's an interesting case study, Smash Hits is, because it started off as what you would call a very broad church. You know, in the early covers, you'd have people like Michael Jackson, you'd even have Elton John on the cover, you know, you'd have Plastic Bertrand was on the cover of the first one. You'd have The Jam, you'd have Sham 69, you'd have quite a range. And then what happens is you get successful, and you start to look at why you're successful. And what you discover is that you've got boys and you've got girls. But you've got slightly more girls than you've got boys. And therefore, success tends to be pleasing the girls, not increasing the boys. So you start looking at, what are the girls like? Well, the girls tend to like this kind of thing slightly more than they like that kind of thing. I know these are appalling generalizations, but they tend to be borne out by sales figures, right? And then you discover people start making records for those girls. So believe it or not, in the early days of Smash Hits and in the 80s, the concept of the boy band was it was unknown. Nobody had heard of it. You just had groups. But then you started having boy bands because they were aimed at girls. So you were aiming at a subset of the girls, right? So what you're doing is, as you refine your proposition, you narrow it. which is a permanent problem in the magazine business. Smash Hits ended up in a place where you could only be on the cover pretty much if you were, you're white male with teeth of a certain, shine and, and between the ages of 18 and 21 and had been to stage school. Because there was kind of the acts that came along. The charts are dead now, dead. And do you know who killed them? I'll tell you. The record companies and the BBC, between them. The glory days of the chart were when a record, believe it or not, used to go in at number 27, go up to number 21, go up to number 9, drop a bit, go up again, and then get a number 1. It provided tension. It was a surprise. And what they did was eventually they said, oh, well, this is too uncontrollable. What we want to do now is play records for 6 weeks before they come out. So now what they do is they play them for 6 weeks before they come out, they dam up the demand, and then they release it onto the market. And so there are 2 kinds of hit records nowadays. Well, there's 2 kinds of record. The ones that go to number 1 and the flops. And the ones that go to number 1 go straight to number 1. And the rest are all nowhere. So Smash Hits has disappeared in the same year that Top of the Pops has disappeared, for pretty much the same reason. That the chart, which used to be immensely exciting and dramatic, has been killed by the people who did best out of it. There's a bigger lesson there in terms of all industries. If you give an industry control, it will kill the golden egg. Because it will make life easier for itself. It'll be looking for ways to make more golden eggs, Can we knock them out slightly cheaper? How many copies would Smash Hits have had to have sold to be still viable nowadays? Well, 100,000 I would have thought would have been some basis, but it was just going backwards because basically teenagers have stopped buying teenage magazines. They now buy, if they buy anything, they buy grown-up magazines, and so you've had this kind of blurring of the distinction between the young women's market, the young men's market, and the teenage market. So if you are trying to reach 15-year-olds now through advertising, I think you'd be looking at Zoo and Heat, which are not magazines aimed at those people at all. Whereas, teenage used to be an area off over here. It's like there used to be a thing called children's television.
Well, in a year where Top of the Pops and Smash Hits have both ceased to be, Kerrang is actually enjoying its most successful year really in our history. We're picking up awards. We've got all-time circulation figures. We had our biggest ever issue sale in April of this year, which is 125,000 copies. So we're enjoying a good time, and I think a good part of that is because our world isn't completely mainstream. We're still a niche magazine, and we still deal with a niche world, and we serve it and know that world better than anything else. I think for the pop magazines, the problem they have is that celebrity and pop stars are everywhere, and so you don't really necessarily need to pick up a pop music magazine or watch a pop music program to get access to those people. You'll see Girls Aloud in Heat and on breakfast shows and whatever. So that world is so saturated through tabloids and celebrity magazines and general daytime TV that it can get a little boring for people. In saying that, Smash Hits magazine, when it closed, had a huge circulation. It's just that and still survives on in different platforms. In EMAP, there is still Smash Hits TV station, but I guess a lot of those readers of that magazine have migrated to other places, and to be honest, a lot of Smash Hits fans who would have been into guitar bands like Busted and Avril Lavigne sort of 5 years ago are probably now been sort of moved on to the Kerrang market, and you can find edgier guitar bands as you grow up.